So where we last left off, we had had this brief experience, sort of flirtation, once again with democracy, where you had this constitutional monarchy of sorts, and ultimately the monarch tries to rein it in, and finally the UK in 1921, so about 15 years after the protests led to this constitutional monarchy, supports this military coup, and Reza Khan comes to power. Reza Khan comes to power, but he's very insecure, as you might imagine after a military coup that's foreign backed. The first thing he does is he centralizes the military, and he sets himself up to become the new Shah. He receives approval from the Majlis in 1925 to become this new Shah, or this king of sorts. So we're still talking about a constitutional monarchy. He's just put on the throne, in a sense, by the UK. What he does while he's in power is he launches a major platform of westernization, westernizing the bureaucracy, establishing a national education system, westernizing the infrastructure, and in other words, going through and for example, you have a huge expansion of the railroad under Reza Khan. He establishes export-based state businesses, so that's that form of spurring the economy that we've talked about. He launches a platform for national conscription. He begins to press for a new national identity and extending the rights of women, to limit the religious opposition. So, for example, he forbids headscarves in public institutions. Very much about westernization. So, trying to undermine religious authorities. Because when you think about who the alternative authorities are, where the resistance might come from, well, we're talking about the religious leaders. We have a very limited democracy under Reza Khan. The Majlis is there, but the press is repressed, the opposition is repressed. As the Brits and the Russians invade Iran several years later, really 2.5 decades later, in 1941, and the reason the Brits and the Russians invade is they want to create a bridge between the Allies, which Iran had not allowed, and they also want to get oil out of Iran. When the Brits and the Russians invade, Reza Khan abdicates the throne to his son, and so his son is Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He comes to power, but he's weakened by World War II, and he's facing growing opposition from the Majlis, and the Prime Minister Mossadegh at the time is growing in strength. And here we could start to talk about a real democracy. So again, what spurred this democracy? Well, World War II, and dissatisfaction with the way the country was being run. And under Mossadegh, who again is the prime minister, so Mohammad Reza Pahlavi is this really authoritarian leader, but he's experimenting with democracy, and Mossadegh really takes advantage of that, and Iran goes left, and he's very populist. They nationalize the oil industry, for example, and then the U.S. and the U.K. have Mossadegh deposed. They have him arrested, and they return central power to the Shah. So Pahlavi, this is really the rise of the authoritarian streak in Pahlavi, and he pursues his own new modernization program. So again, the U.S. and the U.K. were the ones who intervened. Again, these are Cold War allies at this point, and they launched this coup to have Mossadegh deposed. And now Iran is more authoritarian once again. So if you look at the history, well, you can sense from a political culture standpoint that the Iranians might not have a lot of faith in the West, because the West has frequently intervened in order to stymie democracy rather than to further it. And so what the Shah does, Shah Reza Pahlavi at this point, he launches top-down modernization and the White Revolution. So this includes land reform, privatization, a literacy campaign, a campaign once again to enfranchise women. So this is really about westernization again. And again, who might be the most likely to resist this? Well, the religious elites, these entrenched interests. And so the resistance comes from the religious leaders. And in the face of this resistance, the Shah tries to transform the state into a single-party state, with all power to the Shah. And he represses the opposition, clerics go into exile, and in fact Ayatollah Khomeini, who will launch the next revolution, goes into exile and protests from abroad. He's living in France at the time. So under Pahlavi, wealth becomes increasingly concentrated. All the oil money coming in is also leading to another problem that we saw in Spain back in the 16th century, which is what? All the money coming in leads to inflation. When you've got inflation, you've got the erosion of the middle class. You've got shortages of certain items, especially imported items. And this leads to more popular resistance to the Shah. The Shah, while people are suffering under inflation, is seen as this extravagant, corrupt Western stooge who's taking advantage of the country for his own profit, not surprisingly, in a non-democratic state. And so here comes the Islamic Revolution. And the Islamic Revolution sounds like ideational, institutional, individual explanations perhaps could be applied, but probably it sounds like the best explanation is probably an ideational one. That's what it sounds like. But you have to look at the institution, the ideational side, being that this is an Islamic revolution. So people believe in the tenets of Islam. They want Islam to be the source of authority, political authority in their country, and so they back it. But you can also look at the institutional explanations, which were that, again, you have inflation, you have economic decline, and so this gives way to these economic grievances, which mean that any alternative might have sufficed. And now here you've got leaders calling for an Islamic revolution. Well, that sounds just fine. You might have also looked for individual explanations. So the point is, you can use some of these explanations that we've looked at before and apply these to the Iranian Revolution. So, Ruhollah Khomeini calls for Islamic rule. These calls are becoming increasingly popular. Again, remember, he's not in the country right now. He's off in France because he's forced into exile. He is preaching that revolt, and especially martyrdom, against the injustices and the tyranny under the current state are really part of Shia Islam. The slogan that he espouses is neither East nor West, Islamic Republic. So this is important because in the context of the Cold War, they're not siding with the Soviets, they're not siding with the Americans, they're saying we need to go a third way. And the third way here is a theocracy. Muslims should reject the influence of both liberal capitalism and communism. His ideology, vilayat-e-faqih, guardianship of the jurist, is this idea that the government should be run by jurists, Islamic jurists, that Muslims, really everyone, requires guardianship, supervision by the leading Islamic jurists to make the revolution a success and to make society successful. What these jurists are going to do is ensure that there's no deviation from traditional Sharia law. And in so doing, they're naturally going to eliminate poverty, eliminate injustice, and the quote-unquote plundering of Muslim lands by foreign non-believers, as we've seen over the preceding several decades, given the coups. So I want you to think quickly, where have we seen this sort of leadership before? And what does it suggest about Iranian society, or maybe revolutions more generally? I'm pausing here. Right, we have seen this. The Vilayat-e-Faqih reminds me a lot, and probably you and you and you, of this vanguard of the proletariat. We, the few, the enlightened, are establishing these safeguards, this new regime, for your own good, and you will reap the benefits. Okay? But you need to listen to us, because we have the key. It suggests that Iranian society wasn't all that religious or pious. Recall that there were decades of urbanization and westernization going on. But from an institutional standpoint, again, you had all the reasons for revolution. But if society was more pious, you wouldn't have suspected that they would have this sort of vanguard at the top. Do revolutions need a vanguard? Did we have one in France? Well, I suppose we did in a sense, although it took a very different turn. So something to think about. So getting back to the history. So Khomeini, again still in exile, is trying to unite the opposition on socioeconomic issues. Again, the institutional explanation. He's trying to bring the left and the right together. It wasn't that he was exclusively relying on this Islamic dialogue. He was trying to unite people based on socioeconomic conditions in the country. In 1977, he gets an odd sort of boon in that his son, who's still living in Iran, dies. He actually dies of a heart attack, but his death is quickly blamed on the intelligence services. And what this leads to is a first round of demonstrations. So in early 1978, you've got Islamist student demonstrations, and the police come out and they react with bullets and they kill several, somewhere between 2 and 70, depending on whose records you want to believe. 40 days later, you've got a funeral, you've got marches, the government a memorial, you've got marches, and the government goes out and they kill more. Okay, because they've got these marches, and so they again respond with bullets. And this time, between 10 and 500 people are killed, and this begins a cycle. Throughout 1978, you've got increasingly violent protests and an increasingly violent reaction. And with each of the deaths of the protesters, you have martyrs. Okay, which bring and then the funeral procession and the memorial procession brings about more people into the streets who are then killed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's this vicious cycle. So, and you'll see this again in other contexts when we talk about other cases. But how would you deal with this explosive situation if you were the Shah? Think about this. What would you do? Well, what did the British king do in 1215? What did the Russian Tsar do in 1905? What was the Iranian experience previously? When we had the 1906 protests. Well, what you do is you give in a little. You give some crumbs to the people. And so this is exactly what happens. The Shah offers crumbs. He promises elections. He fires the head of the intelligence services. But again, the growing economic grievances mean that people aren't happy with this alone. And at the same time, you've got an economic crisis, so you've got spending cuts, which leads to a rise in layoffs. So you've got more economic grievances, more demonstrations, more deaths, and again, you've got this cycle. In December of 1978, millions of people demonstrated against the Shah. And this was orchestrated in large part by Khomeini, who, again, just a reminder, is still in France. And so the Shah, at this point, dropping more crumbs down, but bigger crumbs, appoints a new liberal prime minister. But even this doesn't help. In January of 1979, the Shah flees from Tehran, and Ayatollah Khomeini returns, this heroic leader of the revolution. The soldiers of the state quickly defect to him. He takes over other military and police stations, and he's in power. And what we see here is another episode of post-revolutionary violence. Several thousand people are executed. This includes people from the military, higher leaders from the military, those who didn't defect, former political elites who might be disloyal, and the list goes on. And Khomeini wants to put the Shah on trial. The problem is that the Shah has fled. And the place that he fled to was the United States. The United States allowed him in allegedly for medical reasons. But again, remember, he was our friend. And so, you should see the movie Argo, by the way, just for fun. And so the reaction, of course, is the U.S. hostage crisis. You've got massive demonstrations. Then people get over the walls and they take over the embassy. And very few Americans escape. Most of them are stuck there for the better part. I believe it was just over a year and a half. So this horrible hostage crisis. So this is going on. A few months later, in 1980, Iraq, from just across the border, hopes to use the revolutionary chaos in order to destroy the revolution. The Iraqis didn't want this sort of revolution happening in their land, of course. And so Iran found itself in war just after the revolution. And this war lasts until 1988. And altogether it kills about 500,000 people. And again, this should ring some bells. Revolution, chaos, war. Where do we see this? Revolution, chaos, war. Well, you had the Russian Revolution, Civil War, which broke out from there. And of course it happened in the middle of an international war, and there were international actors involved in its civil war. You had the French Revolution, and then within several years you had Napoleon going off to fight a war in the name of the revolution. So Iraq may have been preempting something. I have no clue if there was actually, I would doubt that there was actually an initiative for the Iranians to go to war, but they could have certainly presented it as this sort of situation. So a question to think about is, how can wars affect new regimes? Well, they can threaten the new regime. If it's a long war, you need ever more resources. And again, why did the Shah really fall? Well, the Shah didn't really fall because people wanted Islam as a source of governance. The Shah fell because of these socioeconomic grievances. So this can be a threat. It can also strengthen the regime. It can be used to foment a new identity, to create loyalty. We talked about the ratchet effect early on when we talked about state building. So it can be used to, if you recall what the ratchet effect is, it can be used to as a source to mobilize people, to encourage them as an excuse to increase state revenues, in other words, greater taxation, to streamline the administrative system in order to spend this money on the defense of the state, and increase the size of the state. So, so there are two ways this could go. The key seems to be the willingness to use coercion to keep the opposition fragmented, underground, and helpless in the case of Iran. So you really don't see an opposition growing thanks to the war. This is also an excuse. So this really becomes an excuse for repression of the population. Going back to 1979, you had lots of political parties. Remember that Ayatollah Khomeini had actually gathered the left and the right under this broad umbrella of socioeconomic grievances. And of course, he had this third way, this Islamic revolution. But he had lots of people who were following him, trying to come in under this umbrella to get rid of the Shah. So in 1979, with the revolution, you had lots of political parties. And there were some who had pro-Western views. By 1984, it was easy to clamp down on the repression and on the opposition. By 1984, all but the Ayatollah-backed Islamic Republican Party, the IRP, was banned. And then in 1987, even that one was gone because it was seen as a threat to Khomeini's rule because the party split on economic policy. So again, go back to the war as a catalyst and what war does to the state, and it leads to significant changes. So I'm going to stop there, and we're going to go into the institutions in the next set of slides.